This installment is a part of our webinar series, Thriving as a Diverse Professional, and this series is a part of our Belonging Project. And the Belonging Project is a national effort to support and build community among diverse law students and their allies to combat the impact of COVID-19 in a diverse community. So the goal of this project is to bring together legal industry partners to provide tools, resources, and programs to support the continuing personal and professional development of diverse legal talent. As Laura mentioned, my name is Par, and I will be moderating today's discussion entitled Advice I Would Give My 30-Year-Old Self. I'm joined today by panelists Gerald Pauling and Laura Macklin, who will be sharing wisdom of lessons they've learned throughout their careers and what they wish they had known when they were getting their start in the legal profession. So Gerald is a partner in Seyfarth's Chicago office, and he's the national co-chair of the firm's Diversity and Inclusion Action Team. He has extensive trial and courtroom experience and has represented employers in a wide variety of state and federal employment matters, from complex discrimination lawsuits to class actions. And Gerald also provides advice, training, and counseling to clients regarding employment policies and practices and diversity issues. And Laura is a partner in Seyfarth's San Francisco office. Laura is a member of the firm's executive committee, and she's chair of the National Labor and Employment Department. She's also co-chair of the firm's National and Diversity Inclusion Action Team. And she's a leading member of the firm's Workplace Compliance Group, which is focused on change management and the delivery of practice solutions that help global clients avoid mass litigation and develop internal compliance initiatives. So thank you both for joining us today. What we're going to do is I'm going to just get started and ask our panel some questions. And at the end of the webinar, we'll take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions along the way, please use the messaging feature to submit them, and we will try to get to them at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to get us started by asking you what the practice of law was like when you were 30. I know it's not been that long since then, but how has the practice of law changed?
Laura, do you want to go first?
Laura? Okay, so welcome. Sure. It's interesting. Sorry, barking dog. Time of COVID. The biggest thing that I was thinking about in response to this question was this distinction between, sort of the fact that we work in an industry that has been considered a profession, obviously, for hundreds of years. But that in the last 10 years, at least for me, there has been this movement towards the business of law as well. And so there being much more focus around, a lot of different types of work that Seyfarth and many other great firms, including partners with the Belonging Project, have focused on. And that is really looking at the process of how we practice law, how we can create efficiencies, how we really are a business in addition to being really excellent lawyers. And so that's led, at least me in a journey in my practice, our firm in a journey around focusing on the business of law, how we can, be innovative, how we can infuse technology. And so I think, some of those areas are the biggest ways in which I've seen a difference in the last 10 or 11 years, I guess it is now. Okay, fine, 12 years since I was 30, in order to see a change. So I knew I was going to have to admit my age, but here we go.
Well, I've got you beat by a few. I started practicing law in 1992. I'm 53 this year, and so when I was 30, that was some 23 years ago. Here are some things. The thing that stands out the most to me, along with what Laura has mentioned, is the influence of technology on the way we do our work. When I started at Seyfarth, and I've only been at one firm since I graduated law school, or actually since I was a summer law clerk. I was a summer law clerk at Seyfarth, and I joined the firm after law school graduation in '92. And I remember that we had these big desktop computers called Wang that operated on the Wang word processing system. And really all we used our computers for at the start was word processing. We couldn't do we couldn't access the internet from our desktops. We did research using books in the library. There were maybe 5 Westlaw terminals and 5 Lexis terminals in the library, and that was considered a luxury for among law firms in that time. And we had cell phones, but we didn't have mobile email until Blackberries came around, some years after I joined the firm. And so in ways, there wasn't this continuing pound of emails and responding to emails that there is today. And there was a lot less, we were a lot less efficient. Now I think we work entirely different. I think the speed of the practice of law has increased dramatically. That probably is an advantage to clients, but it makes it much more difficult on lawyers, of course, who are always available and always expected to be responsive. And all that came from technology. The other thing that I think of as a diverse professional is that was very different 20 years ago is the representation of minority lawyers in our firm, in our city of Chicago, and across the country. Now, I think if you look at the data, it will tell you there hasn't been much change for some 50 years now. But I certainly remember being the only Black lawyer in our office. I remember at times being, the only Black lawyer in meetings, the only Black lawyers in courtrooms, and that happens to me with far less frequency today than it did when I started. And so, there has been, a lot of things that have changed since I started practicing law back in 1992, but I think those are the things that stand out in my mind.
Wow, thank you both so much for sharing. It sounds like we're definitely on a good trajectory here in terms of the legal practice and where we're headed. Good to see how we've grown, but we are super excited to hear from you both about how your experiences in your 30s and in your early legal practice have shaped who you are today. So what I want to do is I want to start with this. Putting yourself back in the mindset of when you were 30, where were you in your career? What did you think you would be doing in 2020? Are you roughly in the position you thought, or you hoped you would be, or maybe you far surpassed where you thought you would be? Laura?
So yeah, that's a great question. So, when I was 30 and practicing, I was an associate at Cypher. I was involved in some firm-wide activities, but I will certainly answer your question by saying that I'm not doing what I thought then that I might be doing. I think that my sights were probably much more limited in what I thought that I might be able to do with the firm or within our profession. And I think there's still a lot more to be doing, but I don't think I ever would have probably believed that, for example, I could have certain leadership roles at the firm, as one example. I was also working a lot, it was very associate driven hours. So it was, I feel like it was, I was actually coming into the office physically pretty much every Saturday. There was another partner that used to come in a lot into the office named Brian Ash, and we would wave in the hallways and we would say hello. And we would go to work, and then we would log off, and usually Sunday was the day that I took off. And so it was a lot more in person, and just billing a lot of time and a lot of hours. I think the vision was just, more of a bit of an imposter syndrome thing. Like, I hope they don't figure me out. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I'm going to be really lucky to be here in 6 months. So I think it was a much more limited, kind of time frame and trajectory that I had for myself. What about you, Gerald?
Yeah, so I made partner in the year 2000. So I was 30 when I 30. Um, and I was a young partner in the firm. Now, back then, we didn't have a two-tiered partnership with income partners and then equity partners. You went straight from being an associate to being a partner. And I was listening to Laura sort of talk about, being in the office basically every day of the week except for Sundays. And I distinctly remember for years I took the first train to downtown in Chicago from my home in the south suburbs. The first train every day, and I was on the last train every evening. And my wife and I joke about it now, but I started at Sci-Far with the intention of making it to partner, and I think that's one of the things that has changed today. Not everybody that joins our firm joins to be a partner, and I actually understand that thinking there's a certain level of sophistication to it. So when I was 30, I was where I had set my goals on being. I hadn't nearly begun to accomplish all of the goals that I had for myself, um, and I still haven't accomplished some of the goals that I had for myself. But I do feel like when I was 30, I was where I wanted to be. All of by the time I was 30, a number of my law school classmates had already been at two or three different law firms, and I had not bounced around like that. And as a result, I was able to kind of hit a stride at Sci-Farth and do the things that were required of me to get to partnership. I didn't make it my first time up, but I made it, my second time up, and so I was where I had hoped and intended to be, but I was by no means a finished product at the time. By the time I was 30,
Thank
I
you
also
both so
remember
much.
I also remember how much hair I had then compared to how much I have now, and I remember the color it was compared to the color it is now.
Thank you both for sharing. So it's interesting. You both bring up this concept of, basically working quite a bit when you were getting your start. And so that's very interesting to me as an associate myself. I also endeavor to work basically as much as I can because I think by doing that, I'm advancing my career in a huge way. So my next question for you is, what were you doing when you were getting started or around the time you were 30 years old that you thought was going to get you ahead in your career that in retrospect you don't actually think was helpful? And then vice versa, what do you wish you had done to advance your career but you did not do? Gerald?
Yeah, it's kind of the same version of different versions of the same answer. Um, I really sort of began to hit a stride when I stopped worrying about what everybody else and the opportunities that everybody else was getting, and I started really focusing on my desk. There is I think it's human nature probably to compare yourself with other people and to try to, you know, um, blaze your trail um, following others. And I remember that I started to do much better when I started focusing on what I had in front of me and what I had on my desk, and how to excel in the cases that partners had extended to me, and stopped worrying about what cases everybody else was getting to work on and what meetings they were getting to go to, and that sort of thing. It was entirely unproductive. It was some of the best advice I've ever got in my life from one of the best mentors I've ever had in my life. He just kind of said, you gotta not worry about all this noise around you. You gotta focus on what's on your desk, and if you knock that out of the park, then people will find you, and they'll want to work with you. And he was absolutely right, and that's exactly what happened. I started to really turn up on the stuff that I had, that I was working on, and really started to hit it out of the park for the partners who had given me a shot. and there was a little motivation in that to sort of, these were the folks who had entrusted their relationships and their credibility to me. I wasn't about to let them down. And so, for me, it was the thing that I was doing that was working against me it was an aspect of focus, because I'm a very competitive person, and I'm very determined, and what I needed to do was focus less on the competition and more on the determination to do a good job, and that made all the difference in the world for me.
Wow. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more about that point. Focusing on you as opposed to looking around the room and at other people. Laura?
Yeah, so I can start with saying the things that I spent a lot of time doing, or how I was directing my time and energy, and why that was a mistake. So I do believe that hard work pays off, right? So I think sort of a core value of, I'm willing and I want to work really hard. I think the one thing that I did when I was an associate, and frankly all the way up to when I was, in partnership, and I find myself making the same mistake now, is kind of random acts of activity, feeling like as long as there's, sort of quantity or volume of things that I'm doing, that something will come out of that. And so it was much worse when I was an associate, and I called it random acts of marketing and random acts of business development. And, I was one that would go to all of the happy hours and all of the events with the minority bar associations and all of the different things. And I think it was just completely scattershot. And, what I've learned since then, and what I'm really happy about in terms of our profession, is that first there's more focus on, I guess first there is a recognition that I have individually that a lack of meaningful work-life integration can, lead to, sort of less sustained performance, at least for me, meaning if I'm just scattershot, I'm everywhere all the time, working all the time, I'm a less effective lawyer, I'm less creative, I'm, not there as much for my family, I'm not there as much for my partners and my colleagues, then, showing up after I've taken meaningful time off, or where I've really tried to balance things in a sense of, getting personal time and pursuing personal, interests and activities. So I frankly made the mistake when I was in my later associate years, trying to get to partnership, and even when I was first a junior partner, of not taking enough time off from work. Because I was, I think there's a healthy element of being scared to do it. What if something happens when I'm gone? But I think realizing that nobody is indispensable, that cases go on, clients go on, and life goes on, when you're gone, but that you want to be an effective lawyer and colleague when you're there, was something that I really had to focus on and learn that, there's nothing that I'm doing now, even today, that we don't have a lot of capable colleagues to step in and do. I think the other thing that I realized was being more mindful and maybe purposeful about the ways in which I engaged externally in the profession, and really trying to prioritize better the time that I spend. So ensuring that when I'm engaged with something or spending time on it, that it is something that has a purposeful end, or there's a reason that I've thought about in doing it. So no more random acts of networking or those types of activities. Both of those things have really helped. But it's funny to think about how scattershot it was for a while.
That's actually really interesting, this concept of and networking in particular, which brings me to my next question, actually. So fitting in the legal profession and at a law firm job. So I think sometimes associates, especially diverse associates, worry about fitting in at work. Is this something you grappled with at the start of your career? And are there steps you took to fit in? And if so, given a chance, would you have done things differently? Laura?
Yeah, this is actually a big one for me. So, I've talked actually a lot lately, mostly because I think the timing with the current pandemic, has relevance for some of us who have been impacted by various recessions. So I actually graduated law school the year of 9/11. And so had a summer associate position with a different law firm right before that event occurred. And that year was a really terrible one for the legal industry because lots of us who were intended to walk into different summer associate positions lost our offers, and there was a lot of job loss. And frankly, it's a lot of what people are, saw in, 2008, and even what we're seeing now in terms of how firms have behaved. Although I will say it seems like the profession has learned some since then. So there's a lot more ways in which firms are trying to do outreach to their, summer associates and try to keep them connected with firms. I know that we're really trying to do that, and various partner firms in the Belonging Project are trying to do that as well. But getting back to your question, I digressed a little bit just for context, but, I had spent my summer associate, and I won't name the firm, but I was there for the typical 8-week period. I went to law school in Boston and went to LA for this associateship, or the summer associateship. And I had a family member that had been connected to this firm. I didn't get the job. They had already passed away by the time I was working there, but there was a family connection with the firm before I went and did my summer work with them. So I had this feeling in the back of my head that I was concerned about being out. So for those of you who don't know me on the phone, I'm what I call a 4L, which means a lady, lesbian, Latina lawyer. So showing up for the summer as a 4L in terms of my identities, I was not comfortable being out and talking about the fact that I had a girlfriend and that I was in a relationship with someone of the same sex. And this was, again, it was, years ago before the marriage decision and before there was a lot of attention to LGBT diversity in big law. And on top of it, you can see me, if you can see the video, I am ambiguously Latinx. I think people look at me and they're not sure. So I've, in those two ways have had privilege in my life because I can show up appearance-wise, especially with longer hair, as, a straight, non-diverse woman potentially. And so I, in a lot of work instances, have had to make the decision to sort of reveal, my diversity status, which I will say is in some ways a privilege because, obviously by looking at me, people may not stereotype me because they don't know about my background. So I was not out that summer, but I realized it was the first time I had never been out. And I realized towards the end of the summer that it ended up being the worst decision of my life because it ended up over time being something that I just never talked about my personal life, and I never talked about who I was, talking to on the phone or anything personal. And the feedback at the end of the summer was, we think she's smart, we think she's great, but we really don't know very much about her, which was, I realized not very effective on my part. And and it was also awkward. And I actually got to a point of not really wanting to work there because I didn't know how I was going to show back up, however many months later after doing the summer associateship, and then say, oh, surprise, like there's this whole element of me and this girlfriend who knew about you, but you never knew about her. Like it was all just so strange. So it was a big learning experience for me, and it also taught me that I wasn't my authentic self, and I didn't form friendships or connections to people because of that decision. And so I vowed I would never do that again. So anyway, that's my story.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't, yeah. It's interesting, right? This concept of that like who you are as a person will definitely impact what your coworkers think of you. And when I first started, I also did not really, I felt like I just needed to be like the perfect little summer associate, don't really shine or show my personality. I've definitely learned that that's not the case, and that you should definitely show who you are and let everyone see you for who you are. So thank you so much for sharing. Gerald?
Yeah, so It's interesting because fitting in isn't always, I mean, sometimes it's about how you feel, and you might feel you fit in, but you actually don't. Like you're not, you're different. So my experience was I went to a predominantly white high school. I then went to a majority white university. I then went to a majority white law school. And so being in an environment where it was mostly white wasn't that wasn't strange for me, and helped me to feel like I belonged more at Sci-Fi. Um, but I was comfortable being different from most of the folks in the firm. The thing that was unique for me was I wasn't really used to being the only. And there were times, during my career at Sci-Fi where, I was the only. And the weight you feel as an only is real, and some of it is weight that you place on yourself, but some of it is weight that is placed on by others, sometimes unintentionally. Um, and so uh, there was I felt a great deal of pressure for me to be a hard worker, internal pressure, but also the pressure of understanding that how I performed and whether or not I succeeded might determine whether someone else who looked like me got the opportunity to be successful and play the game, get in the game. And as I said, I'm certain that some of that is uh, internal pressure in my own individual perspective, but I'm also uh, pretty confident that it was not just me feeling that way, but that was the reality. And so, what I learned from that, and what I try to talk to young lawyers about, and sometimes not so young lawyers about, is that um, it does matter um, how you represent yourself in whatever endeavor you are undertaking, because whether you realize it or want to admit it, it will influence how other people experience people who are like you, and it may influence whether or not people who look like you um, have the opportunity to do some of the things that you will have the opportunity to do. And so, while I think that's, clearly, and I'm probably not the only person who's participating in this webinar whose parents told them that they needed to do things, twice as good, and sometimes twice as hard, and sometimes for twice as long. And I've experienced all of that, in my life, not necessarily in practicing law. But, I do believe that people's professional experience with me informs how they think about Black professionals, and it influences whether or not they will work with other Black professionals after working with me.
Thank you so much for sharing, Gerald. You mentioned this concept of working twice as hard, which is a concept I too am familiar with. And it ties back to a concept you raised earlier, which is the concept of imposter syndrome, right? So to add a bit of context here, when I first started, I had a ton of imposter syndrome. Like it impacted me every day, and it impacted my behavior every day. When I started as a summer, as I kind of got my place in the firm, came back, I felt a lot better about myself, and it really didn't haunt me as much. But since we've been on this lockdown, I can't deny that it's been back. Like my imposter syndrome has definitely tripled in size. And it's a feeling that I know a lot of diverse attorneys grapple with. So looking back, it sounds like it's something that you both have experienced, and I'm curious, how did you cope with it? And if you could go back and give yourself advice on how to deal with imposter syndrome, what would your advice be, Gerald?
Yeah, so I guess, so my advice would be that, you got to be very careful about um, uh, pretending to be something that you're not, or pretending to know things that you don't know. There is really, to me, there's no shame in not knowing the answer to something. Sometimes, even if you should. For me, I don't know, just about every week, somebody wants to talk to me about something that I ought to know something about or ought to know the answer to. And I just don't. Either I've forgotten or the knowledge I have about it is dated or whatever. To me, I'm not ashamed by that, because to me, that's an opportunity to learn or relearn or expand my horizons. So, I'm very careful to uh, make sure that people know that I'm not trying to be something that I'm not, or that I'm not, trying to pretend to know things that I don't know. The reality, however, and I think it's a reality for all professionals, but certainly a reality for, um, well, I think more a reality for diverse professionals, is that, sometimes you got to fake it until you make it. When I did my first trial and it was time to cross-examine the first witness, I didn't stand up and say, okay, now this is my first time. I don't really know what I'm doing here. I faked it. And I acted like I knew how to do a cross-examination, and I acted like, I knew to me, and I acted like I knew when the witness was not telling me the truth. And you know what? It worked. And so what I tell folks is, um, you have to decide in your mind who it is you want to be, and then you have to model the habits and characteristics of who that is. And as you become closer to that person that you formulated in your mind's eye, you'll be able to fake it less. But until you make it, you gotta fake it. I coach football, and I always tell I coach running backs and quarterbacks, and I tell them, you know, when you score a touchdown, and you will score a touchdown. Act like you've been there. Don't hoop and holler like it's the first time you ever made it to the end zone, might be the last time you ever made it to the end zone. There's a maturity in crossing the goal line, turning, shaking hands with your teammates, and flicking the ball to the referee. Like, yeah, touchdown, wait another 5 minutes, there'll be another one. But if you're hooping and hollering and dancing and jumping around like you've never scored a touchdown before, there's an immaturity that is reflected in that I don't want my players to exhibit. So you got to fake it till you make it, but 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 you got to be careful about pretending not to be, or pretending to be something you're not, or someone you're not, um, and pretending to know things that you don't know.
Thank you, Gerald. Laura?
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I like the touchdown advice very much. So I think, kind of picking up on some of the themes that Gerald talked about, so I've battled imposter syndrome for a lifetime. It's been terrible, frankly. And I would love to hear from anyone else who has ideas for how to battle it, because it comes up even now. But I think it comes up far less than what it might have done in years past. And part of that does come up with some similar themes. So first, I think in this, for me, it's rooted entirely in this concept of, I don't know what I'm doing, and they're going to all figure it out. And especially in big law, I mean, I went into law school because I did a lot of public interest work. I was a music major before law school. My family, my parents are not lawyers. They are not, my mom was a teacher. My dad was a pilot. So, they weren't like typical kind of white collar office workers. So there was a lot about the culture of working in an office I didn't understand. It didn't make sense to me. There was a lot of this, just everything seemed so new and different. And the idea that everyone would figure out that I didn't know at all what I was doing, and to Gerald's point, that I literally was faking everything till I made it, felt uncomfortable, and it made me feel really insecure. And that insecurity, I think, led to a constant worry that I was okay not knowing everything. I was okay feeling like I wanted to learn, but just that it would be so obvious to everyone that I really didn't know anything, and that I at least wanted to know something, or that I could contribute something to, to what we were doing. I think what has helped over the years is getting a lot more comfortable in my own skin and being fine to even say out loud to others, like, I literally have no idea what I'm doing in this scenario, because, the exciting thing about being a lawyer is that you never have the same fact scenario twice. The way in which the law applies is it's not the same every time. It's a different client. It's a different issue. And so you're called upon to be creative every day, even based on knowledge that you already know. And, we're called all the time, to help our clients figure out complicated scenarios that, maybe nobody's ever figured out before, and that's okay. You just have to be able to be resilient in order to say, these are the issues that might be involved, or I can rely on past learning to understand, sort of a direction of where we want to go. I think also just having amazing experiences where I realized that, being your authentic self actually is a superpower, that people actually, that you're a better lawyer and a better colleague by being, honest about who you are and what you know. Oftentimes, at least in my experience, gets embraced with a lot more enthusiasm and a lot more support from colleagues and others than if you are doing what Gerald said, which is, trying to be somebody that you're not. So the more that you're an authentic, approachable person who is sharing, what you can share and learning and recognizing that you have places to learn, that's sort of the essence of, being human in the workplace of, we're all trying to do our best and get, get good results for our clients and do a good job. And as long as you're, sort of have like a true north in terms of your compass of what you're trying to do. So if your true north is, I'm doing the best for my clients and I'm going to work really hard to do it, even if it's something that I don't yet know. And then secondarily, like my true north is wanting to do what's best for the firm and be a good colleague, that'll get you really far. And so I think what I do now is try to point myself back to those true norths, if I'm living, an existence of doing the best for the clients in the firm, I will pretty much always be right, even if I don't always know what I'm talking about, and even if I'm faking it in that moment.
Thank you both so much. You both raised this idea of authenticity, right? So I want to know how that authenticity is incorporated into your personal brand. So on that note, what do you consider your brand, and how has it developed since you were 30? What advice could you guys give on developing a unique and authentic brand without appearing like you're constantly advertising yourself? Laura?
That's a great question. So, I think it depends on how you're showing up, right? But to me, in a lot of the work that I do, I have a deep desire to look at the legal profession and say that we can do law differently. And what I mean by that is not always maybe the substantive legal work, but how we work as organizations and individuals within those organizations. I have a lot of hope, and I think we have a lot of opportunity to do things differently and to seize on ways in which our profession has been seeing change and has embraced change, to essentially build new and different ways of practicing law that have a lot of recognition for diverse teams and health and wellness and some more work-life integration, to the extent that people want that. So there's a lot of work that I do in that regard now, but in terms of like my personal brand as like a practicing lawyer, I think when I was 30, I felt like the backbone of that was I really want to just be an excellent lawyer. I want to do a really good job on everything. And I think, frankly, that kind of core, it's like sort of the pit and the fruit, right? Like, like that core is always there. Like you want to deliver excellent results and really excellent work product. But beyond that, I really tried to develop one primary area of expertise and then a couple of secondary ones, essentially so I could be a go-to for certain kinds of work that also played into interests that I had. So areas that I was passionate about working in, because otherwise I knew that it would be short-lived that I would actually have a brand in that area. So I worked, and in fact, sort of changed that area of focus when I was kind of a senior associate, I guess, where I really redirected to do, less in California. A lot of us do a lot of wage and hour work, and I still do that. But I really redirected to try to do a lot more systemic, discrimination litigation in the EEO context, and a lot of work kind of parallel to that, because I knew that I was passionate about those areas and that I would be willing to read case law, on my own late at night, just wanting to learn and wanting to expand my knowledge horizons, and that really helped. So those are some, I think, fairly rambling thoughts on that topic, but I'd love to hear from you, Gerald, about what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, so I do think your personal brand needs to sort of line up with the personal characteristics that you have own or are trying to develop. Because if you don't synchronize that, then basically you spend your professional life, being an entirely different being than you are in your personal life, and that's just very difficult, to accomplish. And so as you're developing a brand, you kind of have to be thinking about the kinds of things that are important to you personally. And frankly, you've got to do an assessment of your skills, and you've got to know what you're good at, what you're strong at, and kind of what you're not good at or what you're not strong at, and build your brand, obviously, around your personal strengths. The things that made me successful as an associate was I was reliable. I worked incredibly hard, and I was never afraid of any fight. And what that led to was partners coming to me with very difficult cases and problems that were high level that were high level problems involving sort of leaders of companies, because they felt like I was someone they could put on the team and put in front of this client, because if it needed to get done, and it was going to take someone going 20 hours straight, they knew that was something that I was willing to do if that's what it was, if that's what was called for. Now, what I had to learn to be careful about is you can't always give that to everyone. So you can't be the person who's going to work 20 hours for anybody that comes and asks. You have to be selective about how you invest yourself and who you give yourself to. But that was my brand as an associate. There wasn't anyone that worked harder. There wasn't anyone that was going to be there. I was always going to be there. And that has carried over into very important, client relationships. I wanted to say on this call, if I don't say anything else, the people who give you work when you're 50 are people who you actually meet when you're 30. And the big client relationships that I have are all client relationships that started when I was in my 30s. And so those are the people who know that I show up. Those are the people who know that if they call me with something hard, I'm not gonna, find a way to say no. I'm gonna find a way to say yes and find a way to help them. And I feel like that has become my brand. I'm a problem solver. And people know that they can trust me with their most difficult problems or their most innermost feelings, and I'm not going to go, tell the universe about it. I'm going to want to help them with whatever their problem is. So in terms of developing a brand, I think you've got to really do some honest self-assessment and goal setting. And I don't think you ought to box yourself into thinking like your brand is one thing. Because it's not a singular thing. Your brand may be three or four things. So be honest, and don't think too narrowly in terms of developing a brand.
Thank you so much, Gerald. I couldn't agree more. So with that, we would like to take some questions from the audience now, but before we do, just a few announcements. So CLE credit is pending for this course. The code for it is SS2553. So attendance forms will be provided in the post-webinar email that we will be sending out to registrants, so look out for that. And also in that email, we will be announcing our next webinars, and the very next webinar we will be hosting as part of the Belonging Project will take place on June 12th at 3 p.m. Eastern, and it will be a discussion by national bar leaders on prioritizing diversity and inclusion during the pandemic. And after that, on June 17th, we will host a webinar on interview tips for recorded interviews. So look out for the announcement on that, and please be sure to join us for those. With all that said, I would like to pose this question from an audience member. Hi, Laura and Gerald. Did you find/have allies early on in your career? And if so, how did that happen? Some firms lack formal programs, and working twice as hard isn't enough without a voice at the table where promotion and compensation is being discussed. Gerald?
Yeah, it's an outstanding question, because Laura and I could sit here and tell you, yeah, we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps and we made it on our own, and we would be entirely pulling the wool over your eyes. Success requires help. Right. And, so, and I'm not beyond receiving help or constructive criticism or feedback. So yes, I did have allies. They weren't who I thought they would be. I mean, I'm a, Black kid from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. One of my chief allies was a old white Jewish guy. And there was just something he saw in my determination to succeed, made him become a champion of mine. And I mean a literal champion of mine. I wouldn't have made partner without him. And I was fortunate to have, three or four of those guys who, as they got to know me, extended themselves to me, and they watched me fall down, and they helped me get back up, and they didn't tell the world about all the mistakes that I made. That wasn't their point. Their point was to help me develop. And there are people, and they taught me, and my dad had told me this, and these guys exemplified it. I should say these ladies and gentlemen, because it wasn't just men. But my dad told me there are people who want to see you succeed, and there are people who will help you do it. And you need more of the second than you need of the first. You won't get to success just by people wishing that you get there. You get to success by people who are willing to extend themselves, to help you move in the direction that's going to make you successful. And so yes, allies are very important. I had them. I had excellent mentors. I had to learn how to be a good mentee, in the same way that some of them had to learn to be good mentors to me, because we came from very different places in life, and we had to learn, to have a mentoring and mutually beneficial, relationship. But what it took at the beginning was them being willing to extend an opportunity to someone that they might not otherwise have, extended that opportunity to. And it took, on my part, being willing to be vulnerable, and show myself, and do my level best on behalf of people who are giving me a shot.
Thank you, Gerald. Laura?
Yeah, no, great question. And hi to the audience member who asked it. It's nice to see your name. So I also did have allies. I think that it's a great question because Gerald's completely right. You can't really get anywhere unless you have different supporters who are willing to help you. And the question really talks about, sort of having a voice at the table when promotion and compensation is being discussed. And I think that's right. I think for, certainly within the law firm context, but also within companies, it's really helpful to sort of understand who is at the table for those kinds of conversations and make sure that you are doing what you can to be visible to them. And I think those types of leadership groups can, individuals within them can show up very differently, especially for diverse attorneys. And what I mean by that is I like to think about, and some people have already heard me, use this concept in the past, but I like to think about it as kind of a board of directors generally that you might have, for your career. The analogy being, of course, that you may have some people on your board of directors who are more in a mentorship role. They might tell you some advice about your day-to-day work. Or there might be somebody who shows up in your personal board of directors who's like more of a sponsor, who at the table will, when promotion and compensation is being discussed, they will speak up for you and they will talk about your work and they won't talk about the negative aspects or the learning parts of what you're doing as much, or they'll be fair to you and how that conversation comes up. I think there are also people who show up as coaches, the day-to-day, kind of encouraging you to find your path and to work really hard. I think understanding how people show up for you is an important, clue in the puzzle of how you might have allies in those conversations. And understanding who you should focus on and educating to make sure that they know what you're doing, know who you can trust and what they say in the room. And sometimes you may not know what what everybody says in that room, but being active and communicating. I mean, one big lesson for me when I first got into a leadership role within our firm, in a substantive role, not in the diversity space, but, it was a very short time frame before I had about 5 majority men contact me to tell me about all the things that they were doing and all the great work that they were doing and how that, came into a, relevancy about their compensation. All of this education. Never once had I ever thought to do that because it seemed awkward and it just was strange. But I found it's just anecdotal, but I found it interesting that not one of our diverse attorneys picked up the phone and did that. Now, maybe, I had relationships with many of them, but it was just really interesting, like who I've noticed over the years does that kind of advocacy. And so I go out and I'll make sure to ask people if they're not advocating for themselves, what are the things that I need to be emphasizing when I'm at the table having those kinds of conversations. But it's also sort of incumbent upon us to have those conversations to educate others as well so they know what to say in case there might be information that's missing or they wouldn't be aware of. It's up to us to educate folks on what they should be most aware of.
Thanks so much, Laura. So we have a few questions left and we are kind of running short on time. So I will pose this one next. What if so it's it piggybacks off the question that was just posed. So what if you are in a firm where giving feedback and being a mentor is not the norm?
It's difficult. That's a difficult situation because, the good feedback is, key to development, obviously. My thought would be, if you're not getting that feedback from your own organization, one, there's some, you should be asking for it, but assuming that you're actively trying to get it within your own organization, if you're not getting it, you shouldn't stop there. You should seek other sources, of feedback because it's critically important. And so if there are law school professors or partners or, folks in other firms who you can turn to for feedback about, career development or, business development, whatever it might be, you may have to go outside your organization if you're not getting it within your organization.
Thanks, Gerald. Laura, anything to add?
No, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, I do agree, you know, you can turn to other sources. You know, I think that it's incumbent on all of us to try to actively seek feedback at any step of the way. So it may also be something where you could talk to peers or maybe not your direct manager within a firm that may not, you know, have that type of culture, but there may be kind of secondary sources within your own organization that may be willing to give you that feedback. You know, and then also there's an opportunity of suggesting, you know, constructively, of course, that there be a change in your organization if this is not the norm. I mean, it's certainly something that would be ideal, and if that's not happening, you know, it's unfortunate that that's the case. So
thank you, Laura. So with that, we are at our time mark, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, just in case you didn't jot it down, the CLE for this is pending, but the CLE code is SS2553. Please look out for our email about upcoming events, and thank you so much to Gerald and Laura for joining us today.
And thank you, Par, for moderating. Really appreciate it. Nice job.
Of course, thank you. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.